number of parents representing themselves in court in custody hearings since the government cut legal aid a year ago. That's according to new figures released today. The cuts on the 1st of April 2013 removed nearly all family law advice from the legal aid scheme, meaning that people can't get funding for divorce, child contact or residence disputes. Figures for the first full year since those reforms show 19,000 more parents have gone to court without a lawyer, so they're just representing themselves. We asked for an interview with someone from the Ministry of Justice. No one was available, but they sent us this statement. We've increased mediation funding, as it's often more successful, less expensive and less stressful than going to court. In some cases, like those involving domestic violence, court is the only answer, and we've made sure legal aid remains available there. There have always been a significant number of people representing themselves in court, and we've improved the information and help available to them. Earlier this year, we had exclusive access to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. During our interview with its president, Lord Neuberger, he told me about his own concerns about cuts to legal aid.
At a time of financial crisis, it's inevitable that there are cuts. However much legal aid is available, there will always be the odd case of somebody who should have got money when they didn't to pursue their claim. But I am concerned that we are getting into a position where there is a serious risk of people being denied access to justice, and there's no point giving people rights, whether human rights or civil rights or family rights, if they can't enforce them through the court.
We'd like to hear your experiences this morning. If you have represented yourself in a civil court because legal aid wasn't available, 0500 909 693, and wasn't available because of the reforms which came in over a year ago. With us today, Mark Patin, who's a mediator with the group Lawyer Supported Mediation, and the man who asked the MOJ for these figures. Also with us, Robert Cheney, dad of 3, who successfully represented himself in family court. He now volunteers at the charity Families Need Fathers. James Maguire is with us. He's a lawyer. And Julia, not her real name, had to represent herself in a family court. She was trying to stop her husband from taking their 2 children out of the country. Welcome all of you. Let's begin with Robert and Julia. Julia, explain to our listeners why you ended up fighting for custody of your children in court and representing yourself.
Yes, I've been living with years of domestic abuse. It was emotional abuse and financial, was controlling behavior, coercive behavior. And so when my husband threatened me to take my 2 children abroad, and I just didn't know what to do, so I rang Rights of Women organization, and they told me that I had to apply for prohibited steps order against him, which I have done, and I have filled the form myself. But when it came to attending the court hearing, and I was trying to get legal aid, to get some kind of legal advice, I have been denied it. I have been denied access to legal aid because there was no evidence of physical abuse. There was no letter from my GP. There was no hard evidence, and according to that, I think it looked like I haven't been abused. So there was no history of abuse. So I couldn't do anything.
In terms of the court process itself, can you describe what it was like representing yourself?
It was terrifying, to be honest. But luckily, I found my support worker found for me a Mackenzie Friends team. So that's the person, Chris. He's a lawyer. He couldn't represent me, but at least he gave me advice, and he sent me an email what I have to say in court and things like that. But it was really, really terrifying. I didn't know where I was going, and I was about to take my application back because there was a lot of pressure from my husband. There was a lot of pressure from his relatives, and I thought I had nobody to stand by me. The law is not on my side, and my case is considered not bad enough. So it was really, really hard.
But I think you did win a residency order, so the children live with you, and you won a court order to prevent him taking the children out of the country.
Yes, I have done that, but I was very, very lucky again to find a good lawyer who didn't charge me a lot of money, but he didn't represent myself, but I have found somebody as Mackenzie Friend. But I don't think anybody could have done that, because in some cases, if there would be more pressure on me, even have the courage to go to court. So,
James Maguire, how do you assess the impact on individuals of having to represent themselves?
Well, that example is a very good one. Quite a serious case of parental child abduction. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But it's very difficult, particularly in a family situation where there is naturally emotion, there's suspicion of the legal system and lawyers, and just that lack of experience in terms of, with all the emotion running there and the risks and concerns, how do you present a case? What do you say? What do you do? Where do you go? And all of these can be very daunting for a litigant in person.
Mark, tell us about your organisation and the aim of it.
Good morning. I'm an organisation that specialises in bringing lawyers and mediators together because historically speaking, and obviously James will have a view on this, lawyers and mediators can do something quite magical for people who are in conflict. They can encourage effective communication, which is ultimately in the interest of the child. It's something a judge can't dispense with an order, and we know that unresolved conflict is what harms children's prospect. So, rather amazingly, when I studied this, for the last 3 years, it was clear to me that we have mediators in one camp and lawyers in the other. So the mediators are always of the view that what they did could help people. They didn't really like lawyers meddling with it. You just got your agreement at the end. Whereas the lawyers, where most people turn to because people want advice, they were quite distant from the mediators, and you have a spectrum of some lawyers being quite disparaging towards mediation, and at the other end of the spectrum you have lawyers that are genuinely trying to encourage people. But for the most part, we've never built a market for mediation in this country.
Is it enough for the government to increase mediation funding, as they say, in order to try and prevent people ending up in family courts, for example?
No, and it's a pity no one from the MOJ had the time to come and talk to you. As they said,
it's not the first time.
No, they don't talk to me either. They allocated £25 million to fund what they anticipated would be a massive boost in mediation following the withdrawal of legal aid from lawyers. That has failed spectacularly because they refuse to understand, and this is at the ministerial level, not the officials, they get it, that people in conflict, parents in conflict, they never end an argument by saying, you better get yourself a good mediator. So what we've seen is a 40% fall in publicly funded mediation. Mediation services with decades of experience have gone out of business. They've closed their doors. Meanwhile, we see a 20,000 odd increase in the number of people going to court. Now, those increases, they're not all DV cases.
Do you mean going to court, or do you mean representing themselves in court?
Pretty well. Since they cut legal aid to lawyers, we haven't seen a fall in the total number of people going to court. There's been a slight increase. And within that number, as you correctly pointed out earlier, we've seen a massive increase.
Okay.
So people are choosing the judge over the mediator.
Right. Well, that doesn't say much for what you're trying to do then.
Well, no, what we're trying to do is bring the lawyer in, because the MOJ literally divorced the lawyer from the mediator. Before they took legal aid away from lawyers, just to very quickly recap, what would happen is the lawyer would have to refer to a mediator in order to get more funding from the government. And this went on for the last 10 years. And we get about 26,000 people going to mediation a year, 7 out of 10 would reach agreement. But when the money was removed from the lawyers didn't have to refer to the mediator anymore. So now what we have in the low-income end of the market, where people absolutely need lawyers and mediators working together, you have them competing for clients.
Robert, in your own case, you represented yourself in a custody hearing. This was before the legal aid reforms, actually. You took a decision that you could do a better job than the lawyers, is that correct?
Well, I started off having representation, but then, as my ex-partner spent all the money on hers, she represented herself, and I thought that she was getting a better deal at court. The court has to give more leeway to people who represent themselves. So then I couldn't afford it, so I ended up representing myself as well, and I thought you do as well.
Right, so your outcome was successful. Tell us about the kind of impact it had on you, the kind of preparation you had to do, the kind of work you had to do.
Preparation is key. It is difficult. You need to get advice from as many sources as possible.
Like where?
CAB,
right.
Families Need Fathers. We run monthly support groups. The internet. You have to make sure all your arguments are ordered. Try and think of yourself as if you were the judge, and what evidence have you got to support your claims. It is nerve-wracking, but actually, like those sort of schoolboy races, once you actually start talking in the court is there to try and get the best outcome for the child, and you actually realise that's what they're interested in. They're interested in evidence and what's good for the child, and to look at how you behave. And again, when you're represented, the the judge will see you for whatever, an hour or 2 hours in the stand. When you're representing yourself, they see you for much longer, so therefore they get an idea, actually, is this person really the awful person depicted in the other statements? And they sort of, I think that helps you, helps your case.
Well, but you're the kind of character who was able to do that work and was able to present arguments logically. Not everyone has that confidence or time or what's the word, or kind of, yeah, I suppose it's just a recognition that they might be able to do that. They might not feel they're educated enough. They might not feel they belong in that kind of legal world.
It is extremely difficult. If you're vulnerable, yes, you should have representation. But I've seen very senior people who are senior within firms melt because of it's a different type of pressure altogether. And at the same time, you might see somebody who's a mechanic who doesn't talk for a living, but actually represent themselves very well because they're passionate. As long as they behave themselves and get their point across properly, they can do that.
Right.
I agree with Mark. Nobody wants to end up in court, but it's the worst solution.
James, I mean, do you buy Robert's argument that actually it can be a good thing for people to represent themselves in court sometimes?
For a judge will want to make sure that a litigant in person is having a fair hearing. So certainly that's good for the person representing themselves because they're able to make the points which they feel are important to them. And the judge has to listen. Sometimes as a lawyer presenting a case, you might want to raise certain things before the court, but the judge will cut you short. I think listening here, one of the main problems is perhaps with the system that we've had for centuries, that it is adversarial, and where you've got couples who obviously would have had a loving relationship, children together, they're then separating, parting their ways. Sometimes with these cases going to court, the common denominator that I see is lack of communication. So it's husband against wife, father against mother, and sometimes it takes a stronger person to actually realise that the court system is, yes, the last resort, but there are other options available, mediation being one.
Let me mention some messages from listeners. Steve in Stevenage says, I was better prepared than the claimant's solicitor. The judge found in my favour because I was completely honest and had all of the evidence to back up my defence to hand. Whereas Sarah, who's texting from somewhere in Wales, says, I represented myself for nearly 5 years through the family courts. My ex got legal aid, despite earning at least 3 times what I did. I was denied legal aid, and multiple judges questioned this. My ex only stopped taking me to court when his legal aid stopped, but the process nearly broke me mentally. The pressure and the stress was unbearable, which I think a number of people would relate to, Mark, which is why you, and Robert's nodding his head as well, is why you'd say, try not to get to the family court stage, which is part of the motivation for the government making the reforms, rightly or wrongly, that it did.
No, quite right. I mean, one can't fault the sentiment of trying to encourage informed dialogue among separating parents in particular, because as I said earlier, that's what the children need. They need mum and dad to build some trust and begin to communicate. But that is a difficult process. I mean, you may be aware of something called the loss curve. It's where people emotionally, when they break up, often the party who decides to end the relationship, they go through that loss curve while they're in the relationship. They rock up at the lawyer's office and they want to get things moving.
Sorry, I don't know what the loss curve is.
The loss curve is, if you separate from somebody, you may go through the anger, denial, upset, depression, then you'll come out the other side in terms of moving on and beginning again. And it's not a particularly linear process. One can oscillate. And when two people end a marriage, and they have children, it's ripping one life apart. They're going back to, being co-parents is what they're going to become. And to force mediation upon people, which is what the government's doing, it's saying they changed the law in April. So if you want to take your ex-partner to court, and James will know all about this, obviously, you cannot file your papers at the court until you've visited a mediator.
Gosh.
Okay, so they're using compulsion, which is such a weak lever, because what we know mediation works spectacularly well. In the last year, while we had smaller numbers of people going, 8 out of 10 reached an agreement once mediation was underway. So we know it's spectacularly efficient when people give it a chance. But getting people to the mediator, it's extremely difficult because you can't ride with one partner. You have to wait for the other one to enter that space of readiness, give that mediator some willingness, and that's what we do with the lawyers. The lawyers support what we do with fixed fee legal advice, so we can give people some certainty around cost, very difficult in the family law world, and we can slow the process down. You're going to wait weeks and months for a hearing at court anyway, but if we can use that space to incubate some willingness, what we're finding, and we're a small pilot admittedly, is that we're getting more couples to be more receptive to the idea of beginning mediation.
Julia, Robert, can you ever have imagined yourself going through mediation with your former partner?
Well, we did try mediation, and
Did you?
And it didn't work.
Okay. What about you, Julia?
I wouldn't imagine a mediation with my husband who is threatening to take the children abroad to live with him. I don't think it would be appropriate, because after living for 7 years with somebody who has been dishonest and trying to make you do things which you didn't want to do by lying to you, it is impossible. He can tell to your face that, yes, no, I'm not going to take the children, but is it good enough? He's promised not to take the children abroad when he's already threatened me. So it is, I don't think it would be appropriate. There's nothing to mediate about. If he's denying everything, how can you mediate with somebody who is denying everything?
Julia, I mean, I won't comment on the particulars of your case, obviously, but that's a very common reaction to the prospect of attending mediation. I mean, I take phone calls from people like yourself every week, and so do lawyers and mediators across the country. And it's entirely right and justified for you to feel that way, of course. But nevertheless, the mediator's skill is about building trust. It's a voluntary process. It's done over a number of sessions. It allows both parties to communicate in real time. The temperature can be brought down. People do reach agreements in the circumstances you describe. It is not a panacea, but given that it's available in legal aid, or even privately, is much more affordable than having a lawyer represent you, I'm always of the view that as long as it's safe and appropriate, and the mediator will screen you at an initial meeting, then there's very little to lose. And like I say, the data supports that most people who begin, they reach an agreement.
I think it is a lot to lose when you lose your two children when they're taken abroad, then you can't return them. It is a lot to lose. It is a big risk, and I can't afford to take it.
I mean, if I could just also add that when the legal aid supported one parent, you often had, and as family needs fathers we found, we were supporting how is it fair that one person in court is legally represented.
Well, that's what Sarah was saying. She represented herself, her ex had legal aid, and it was
exactly
unbearable. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you very much for coming in. Robert Cheney, dad of 3, who successfully represented himself in the family court. He now volunteers at Families Need Fathers. Mark Lopatin. Is that the right pronunciation?
I like the French twist.
I'm sorry, it does look French to me. It's clearly not, though.
It's Russian.
Is it Russian? Okay, tell me how I should pronounce it.
Lopatin.
Lopatin, okay, thank you. Who is from Lawyers Supporting Mediation. James Maguire, thank you, who is a lawyer, and Julia. Thank you for coming on the programme. Julie's not her real name. She had to represent herself in a family court. Thank you, all of you. Your own experiences, very welcome. If you have represented yourself, tell us about that experience, what it was like for you, the impact it had on you, how you tried to prepare. 0500 909 693. Let's bring you the news now. It's 10:31.